Hello and welcome, fellow student doctors. My name is John Barba II. I am an MD MPH candidate here at The Ohio State University, and I am honored to bring to you today a learning module designed to give medical students an introductory level understanding of the role of the healthcare provider in addressing human trafficking. Human trafficking is a severe violation of human rights. Folks, it's modern day slavery, and we as providers can make a difference. We can make a difference by helping to identify these patients and make the diagnosis of human trafficking. By doing this, we can help get them into the care and services they so desperately need and deserve. And if you remember nothing else from this slide, please remember the National Human Trafficking Hotline and the number presented here on your screen. You and your patient can call this number 24/7, and it is available in over 200 languages. Together with your patient, you can make an action plan to help save them from this modern day slavery. To get you introduced to this topic, let's start with a case study. Let's walk through this real-life case study together. A 16-year-old female patient presents to the ED with severe vaginal bleeding. The person with her claims to be her brother and tells the physician that she is schizophrenic, and he fears that she tried to induce an abortion on herself. Due to severe blood loss from extensive tearing of the vaginal wall, the physician sends the patient for emergency surgery, after which she is placed in a locked psych ward and subsequently discharged with her brother. What the physician did not know was that this girl is a victim of human trafficking, specifically for sexual exploitation, since she was picked up at a local mall at 14 years of age as a runaway. The brother is her trafficker who promised her food, shelter, a job, and a better life. Since a pregnant girl is hard to sell for sex, the brother instrumented her with a broken bottle to try to induce an abortion. This was a missed opportunity to save a life. The physician misdiagnosing human trafficking in this case for a variety of reasons. Going through this module will help make you a better physician so that you will be able to identify and diagnose human trafficking throughout your career. Let's now get started. As an overview, in this learning module, we will define human trafficking. Then, we will discuss the human trafficking population, specifically in the healthcare setting. Then, we will discuss the cultural diversity of human trafficking. After this, we will learn how to diagnose and treat human trafficking victims. And finally, we will come to understand and appreciate the role of social workers, who I like to call social justice doctors. Learning to diagnose human trafficking victims starts with understanding and defining human trafficking. So let's begin there. Before going over legal definitions of human trafficking, let me lay a general overview of what human trafficking is in your mind. Of note, we will mainly be discussing sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So, human trafficking begins with the process of recruiting and/or moving and/or harboring and/or obtaining a person via the means of force, which includes things such as raping, beating, and confinement of a person, and/or fraud, which includes false offers of a better life, jobs, marriage, and/or coercion, which includes things such as threats to the person themselves, their family, and other forms of psychological abuse. All of this is for the end purpose of involuntary servitude, which is involuntary labor, and/or debt bondage, and/or slavery, and/or sexual exploitation. Of note, adults need to demonstrate criteria in each of these boxes to be diagnosed with human trafficking. In contrast, minors need not demonstrate the presence of force, fraud, or coercion that is the means for human trafficking to be diagnosed. And that is why in this image you can see that I drew an arrow from the process of all the way over to the end purposes of, because minors do not need to demonstrate the means in which human trafficking is forced upon a person. Being a minor and being put through the processes of and the end purposes of qualifies them under the legal definition of human trafficking. Now that you have a general framework of what human trafficking is, let's build upon that framework with more concrete definitions of what constitutes human trafficking. What constitutes human trafficking was defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, which was passed in the year 2000. As we go through these definitions, look for the key buzzwords of force, fraud, and coercion. Sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such acts has not attained 18 years of age. This constitutes human trafficking. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. This also constitutes human trafficking. This next quote I really want you to read and really pay attention to. A victim needs not to be physically transported from one location to another in order for the crime to fall into these definitions. I think when people hear the term human trafficking, they take the trafficking portion of it quite literally. They think that somebody has to be trafficked across state borders, across countries, across whatever in order to qualify for human trafficking. That is not the case. A person need not be physically transported from one location to another in order for the crime to fall into human trafficking. Make sure you understand this commonly misunderstood point about human trafficking. And lastly, as we covered on the previous slide, under this law, the proof of use of force, fraud, or coercion is not required for the person under 18 years of age in the prosecution of human trafficking. The next step in diagnosing human trafficking starts by understanding the population. In talking about the population affected by human trafficking, let's go through the who's of human trafficking, beginning with the victims. It is estimated that over 800,000 victims are trafficked across international borders annually. However, due to the underground nature of human trafficking, the hidden nature of human trafficking, these estimates are questioned, and some even question if the estimates of how many people are affected by human trafficking annually can even be trusted, because these people are hidden away in modern-day slavery. So when you read statistics about human trafficking, take them with a grain of salt and know that they are truly estimates of the real problem we face in this world. So, in continuation, victims can be female, of which 80% of the victims are estimated to be female, and 50% of those females are actually minors. Victims can be domestic minors, over which it's estimated that 400,000 of the victims are domestic minors, which means these are minors within the United States itself. Victims can be males, they can be adults, they can be transgender or of varying orientations, they can be U.S. citizens, and they can be foreign nationals. The bottom line is they can be anyone. In terms of traffickers, traffickers can be friends, family members, and romantic partners. They can be pimps and sex industry managers. Traffickers can be U.S. and international government employees and employers, such as diplomats. Employers such as households with domestic workers. The bottom line is anyone can be a trafficker. Lastly, buyers can be anyone. Do you get the picture yet? When trying to identify human trafficking, when thinking about victims, when thinking about traffickers, when thinking about buyers, you have to leave your biases at the door. You have to look at everyone with a critical eye and really think, could this be a victim of human trafficking? Could this be a trafficker of human trafficking? Could this be a buyer of human trafficking? Human trafficking is an incredibly profitable industry. We're talking multiple billion-dollar industry. And that begins with having victims, traffickers, and sadly enough, the buyers who consume such a horrible product. Now that you understand that anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, let's walk through what I like to call the healthcare population of human trafficking victims. Looking at this image, this data is from the Polaris Project, in which 88 survivors of human trafficking were interviewed. They were asked if they attended any healthcare services while still being trafficked. Looking at the most common response, you could see that 68% of those survivors reported going to the ER or other forms of a hospital service. Another study that interviewed 98 survivors found that 63.3% of them reported going to the hospital or ER. And you can look down the rest of these lists and look at the other frequencies in which other healthcare sites were visited while still being trafficked. The bottom line is that multiple studies have shown that 30 to 88% of human trafficking victims accessed healthcare services while they were still being trafficked. This is good news because this tells us that as future providers, we will come into contact with these people and we will have opportunities to diagnose human trafficking and help get these victims the care and services they so desperately deserve. And looking at a few quotes from the Polaris Project, one of the survivors said, "I was only able to see healthcare providers on a dire emergency basis. Even when I had broken bones, and I've had 85 broken bones that were documented, many more that were never documented because I couldn't go." So we're only seeing the very tip of the iceberg. I would say we're only seeing the ice cube in the clinics. But make sure that you see those ice cubes so that we can help diagnose human trafficking in the patients that we see. Another quote is, "After I escaped, I went with law enforcement to the ER. The treatment at the ER wasn't what I expected. It's not respecting us as human beings. The judgment, they just see you as a street girl." So even if these patients are being picked up in the ER, they might not even feel safe or comfortable communicating to us that they are human trafficking victims. And we'll cover more reasons for that, but one of them is the stigma and shame that these people feel. And that should not be the case. We need to open our hearts and to open our eyes in the care of these poor, poor victims. We can do better as a healthcare service. The next step in diagnosing human trafficking relies on understanding the cultural diversity of human trafficking. As we discussed, human trafficking can happen to anyone. Therefore, it takes a culturally competent physician to make the diagnosis of human trafficking in their patients. This relies on an understanding and discussion of the cultural diversity of human trafficking. Again, since it can happen to anyone, we will broadly look over what it means to quote-unquote be in the game of human trafficking. And so, let's start by taking a look through the victim's eyes. The victims may have dependency on the trafficker. The traffickers, would they transport them across the international borders or into different countries? They may take their passports, their documentation, their identification. They may control their communications with the outside world, their movements, and their finances, utterly making the victim dependent on the trafficker for survival. The traffickers can also use insider lookouts. They can actually recruit a victim to watch the other victims to prevent escape discussions and attempts. This ultimately destroys relationships between victims and spreads fear and mistrust. Traffickers also use other various means of controls, such as drugs. And this is important to note because the traffickers will involve their victims in other illegal activities, such as getting them addicted to heroin and saying you have to do these sexual acts to get more heroin. And then once the victim's addicted to heroin, they're already doing an illegal activity, and now the victim's less likely to seek out legal help. All of this is the trafficker's game of controlling their victim. And so they'll involve them in other illegal acts such as sexual work and other activities to reduce the likelihood that the victim will seek out legal help. Moreover, the traffickers will make threats to their victims or their families and friends, all in the ways in which they can control their victim and psychologically abuse them into being obedient. Some may ask, why don't the victims just escape or try to escape or report this? Well, they may not try to escape because of fear of the trafficker's threats to their family and self. They don't want to get anybody else killed, so they'll shoulder whatever they're going through to protect others. Moreover, they may fear deportation. If they're in a different country, or say they hired like a coyote or somebody to smuggle them across the border, and then once they're smuggled across the border, then they take their passports and documentation. And now they're in a different country and they have no forms of identification. They're afraid of being deported, and the person that smuggled them across the border now says, "You will do these works for me." And that's basically how they evolve into human trafficking. Not all smuggling is human trafficking, but that's a discussion for another time. Moreover, the victims may be afraid of the police because the police in their country of origin may be corrupt and actually collaborate with the traffickers themselves, which has been reported in numerous countries. And speaking about the cultural diversity and countries of which people come from when they're being trafficked, look at this map. As you can see here, red means very high, yellowish means high, and medium is green. And just take a look over this map, and this just speaks to the cultural diversity in the various populations that are trafficked. And these are just the known cases where human trafficking has been reported. Moreover, victims may fear that no one can help them. And one other really important thing is that minors may be fearful to be returned to their family or placed back with social services. They may actually have had a worse situation in an abusive family or foster home that they'd rather go through the human trafficking acts or umbrella than to go back to that sad situation. It's just a horrible, horrible thing. Moreover, victims may suffer from traumatic bonding. And pulling a quote from one of the resources, traumatic bonding is the coercive control where the perpetrator instills in the victim fear as well as gratitude for being allowed to live. This bond is a survival instinct and a coping mechanism. And, as we discussed earlier, there's addiction needs, and the victims may suffer from various mental health conditions. With this background in mind, Let's now turn our attention to making the diagnosis of human trafficking. Now, let's give you the tools to make the diagnosis of human trafficking. And so, the Journal of Family Medicine and Community Health listed the top 10 indicators of human trafficking in the clinical setting. So let's go through those now. And while we go through these, think back to the cultural diversity slide and the who's of human trafficking that we discussed earlier and see how they relate to these indicators. So one of the indicators, in no particular order, is that the patient is younger than 18 years of age. The second one is that the victim is accompanied by someone who seems to be controlling and may act or pose as some sort of translator. And so this is a very key point that I really want you to remember. So if you take nothing away from this slide, listen very closely right now. So looking at the Polaris survey study results that we looked at earlier, when they interviewed survivors, they found that 47% of them were monitored during health visits. And those usually involved the trafficker themselves or somebody associated with the trafficker accompanying them on their appointments and refusing to leave the room or trying to speak for them. And you'll see that these people, the victims, will have very rehearsed explanations for things, and you have to have somewhat of a human intuition to pick up that this person is being trafficked. Moreover, the traffickers may not accompany them, but they may say they're monitoring them. And I wanted to share one story that I found quite unique, and it has to do with this object right here, this camera, and this hospital room. And basically, the trafficker opened up his laptop before the victim went into the hospital, and he says, I'm not going in with you, but I can watch and hear every move you make because on this laptop I've hacked into the cameras in the hospital, and I can watch and see and hear every move that you make. And this victim was from a foreign country, and she really truly believed that the trafficker could do this. Okay, going back over here, bringing your eyes back to the table, does not have appropriate identification or documentation, or someone is keeping their passport identification card for him or her. Think back to that cultural diversity slide. That really plays into those now points that you understand because you're becoming a more culturally competent physician. The next point is a poor historian. They're unable to give account of their clinical findings with his or her history. Then 5 is unable to give his or her home address or appears to be confused with their whereabouts. That's oftentimes because the traffickers keep them very isolated from the outside world except when they're performing the labor or sexual acts requested of them. 6 has visible signs of physical abuse and neglect. We'll get to some of those on the next few slides. Actually, unusually fearful or submissive with poor eye-to-eye contact. One thing that I didn't mention in the cultural slide is that the women being trafficked by like pimps, they have to keep their eyes down gaze because if they look and see the eyes of another pimp, they now belong to him. They become his property. So if you see down-gazing eyes and women or even men or anybody that doesn't seem to want to keep eye contact or anything like that, that should make you suspicious. If they speak no or limited English, if they have recently entered the U.S. from Asia, Eastern Europe, India, Africa, or Latin America, think back to that slide of the map that we reviewed and all those countries of origin, and if they have an unusual tattoo, like a person's name, a street name, or signs an unusual location on the body. As we'll see on the next few slides, I'll actually show you some tattoos that pimps use to actually brand their victims. And so thinking through these indicators, again, please focus on number 2, that they are accompanied by someone who seems to be controlling and may act as a translator. And this is one of the key reasons, as we'll discuss later, that 1, you want to get the patient alone, and 2, if they don't speak English, you need to get a translator. You cannot use a family member, you cannot use anyone like that, because you do not know if that person who is interpreting for them is in fact a trafficker. You must give them the resources to be able to move from victim to survivor, and that is up to you as the physician. Now, I want you to pause this video and take 62 seconds. That's how long it took me to read through these physical, behavioral, and environmental indicators of human trafficking in the healthcare setting. This table was composed based on the survivor responses in the Polaris project, so please take your time and read through them carefully. What else could you do in the next 62 seconds to make you a more culturally competent physician and hopefully help you one day diagnose a victim of human trafficking? The Journal of Family Medicine and Community Health also released a table of common physical exam findings in persons suspected of human trafficking. So let's go through that together. They say that persons may have multiple bruises, whip marks, finger impressions, and ligature marks. Ligature marks are marks on the skin caused by the wrapping of ropes or cords or other such things that induce skin trauma. Warning, I'm going to show you a picture of what ligature marks look like, so please prepare yourself. As you could see on this person's neck, some sort of rope or cord was wrapped around her neck and induced skin trauma. This is a sign called a ligature mark. Patients may also appear malnourished, they may have poor dental health, they may experience genital trauma, and they may have anal trauma. One thing to look out for in pediatric patients is actually that forced sex through the anus may actually pull the intestines outside of the body through the anus. So that is a general sign of sexual abuse, and that person may be a victim of human trafficking. Other signs include burns from cigarettes, hot iron and acid, and new and old fractures, as well as signs of substance abuse. Remember, traffickers commonly use drugs to control their victims, so please look out for track marks on their arms and other withdrawal signs of illegal substances. So, next, let's talk about some findings that are more specific to sex trafficking. So pimps will actually use tattoos to brand their victims. This is a sign of ownership, and let me show you what this looks like. As you can see here, these two women have crowns tattooed on them. The crown is an infamous symbol of a pimp's mark on a victim. But not every crown you see is a person's being a victim of human trafficking, but it should make you suspicious. And as we'll discuss later, getting these people in touch with social workers who can set them up with people who can tattoo over these things or can help remove these tattoos is one of the best steps to help the mental health and recovery of these human trafficking victims. Another thing you may see in sex trafficking is frequent untreated STIs, which can lead to pelvic inflammatory disease. As we discussed earlier, 50% of the women who are trafficked are minors. So these people, starting from a young age, can get multiple STIs, and this can lead to pelvic inflammatory disease, which, as we know, can lead to infertility. Another thing is with pregnant patients. These patients often are having sex with many, many clients and being forced to have sex with many, many clients. And these clients may or may not wear condoms, and so pregnancies can and do happen. And so keep this in the back of your mind as a differential, that the person who's pregnant may be a victim of human trafficking. Another thing is toxic shock syndrome. Why is that? Well, let me pull up a little image of toxic shock syndrome. And I want to bring your focus right down here. Toxic shock syndrome is associated with menstruation and tampon use, right? Why would a sex trafficking victim have their tampons end too long? Well, it's hard for pimps to sell women for sex if they're menstruating. So they will have them keep their tampons in much longer. They will use other things to keep basically the cervix from letting out the menstrual flow, and this will cause a backup. And as we know, when there's a backup of tissue like that, the bacteria can proliferate, and if that Staphylococcus bacteria releases the superantigens, that can lead to toxic shock syndrome. So please keep human trafficking in mind when you see a patient with toxic shock syndrome. Okay, now let's move on to some things that are more common findings with labor trafficking. So labor trafficking, the number one thing you need to look out for is safety violations, because these workers are often being forced to work in unsafe environments. So if you see things like work-related injuries, you may want to think, did that person have the proper safety equipment, or is this person suffering from labor trafficking? You may think, if you see somebody with severe exhaustion, dehydration from work, and if you see any toxins or weird environmental exposures, you may think, is this person a victim of human trafficking since they did not have the proper safety equipment? Please keep human trafficking in your vast and broad differentials when seeing the patient in front of you. The next key to diagnosing a human trafficking victim is asking the right questions alone, every encounter, and with a translator if needed. Let's walk through this quote from a human trafficking survivor about her experience in the healthcare system. Since I was often taken to different doctors and to the ER to treat trafficking-related injuries, I wish that someone would have taken me aside and asked those screening questions, or even asked me if I was okay. Had they simply separated me from my mother, my father, or the people that they would send with me, and just asked me if I was okay, you know what? I might have been too scared to disclose the first time, but maybe if they would have done this several times in a row, I think I would have found that to be a place of safety and perhaps even divulged what was happening. So this quote brings up a couple of the points that I noted over here. You have to get the patient alone because there's people posing as their mothers and fathers. You can't assume anything. You have to get the patient alone so that they have the opportunity to confide in you. And you have to do it every encounter. You have to ask screening questions in every encounter because, as she said, she may not have confided in you the first time you ask, but if every provider she sees asks these questions and asks them repeatedly, maybe she would build up the courage to be able to confide in you this very, very sensitive information. Next, while she didn't specifically say this, you always have to use a translator if the person doesn't speak your language, because people may pose as translators, they may not be relaying back what you're saying to them. You never know. So you have to use a translator so that you give the patient the resources to be able to communicate directly with you, their provider. And so, what questions could you ask them? Well, here's a list. I won't read it to you. These are the 10 most important provider questions per the Journal of Family Medicine and Community Health that you could ask to screen for human trafficking. The ones that I always keep close to my heart and my mind are to always ask, do you feel safe at home? And what does home look like for you? And usually based on those two questions, or maybe even a third follow-up one, I can get somewhat of a human intuition as if I need to keep asking social history questions or if I need to keep divulging in. Use your human instinct to guide you. And as medical students, I should say that we often have many, many things in our white coat pockets. You could even print off this list, put it in your white coat pocket, and if you ever feel like you need to ask these questions, they'll be right there at your fingertips, or you could look them up online too at this resource right here. Now that you know how to diagnose human trafficking victims, let's teach you how to treat human trafficking victims as a healthcare provider, which really comes down to the decision to report or not to report. You're ready to diagnose human trafficking, but should you report it, and how exactly do you treat the patient? Let's walk through these considerations together. First, you are legally mandated to report human trafficking and abuse of minors. No ifs, ands, or buts. This is in contrast to adults. You are not legally mandated to report human trafficking of adults. Why is this? This kind of seems paradoxical. This has to do with safety concerns for the victim as well as the victim's extended network. You see, if authorities are involved or other pathways are explored, this could make the victim not be able to return to the trafficker or spook the trafficker, or all sorts of circumstances can occur. And then if the trafficker something happens to him or her, or something along those lines, they may carry through with their threats of killing the victim's family, and all sorts of madness can ensue. It's really a safety concern, and it gives flexibility of the provider and the patient to come up with the best action plan for them. And that is the key takeaway from this entire slide. You must involve the patient in developing an action plan that is best tailored and specific to their needs and circumstances, so that they can best explore how to get out of human trafficking in a safe and effective manner. Now, there are some things that you should absolutely do for every human trafficking patient. That is, you should always treat immediate injuries, illnesses, assess for suicidal ideation and safety, and identify pregnancies. Moreover, as I previously stated, you should always involve the patient in developing an action plan. Again, the patient is your greatest and best resource, as they always are in every clinical situation. Next consideration, I would say, is try to involve the social worker if they are available. Social workers can have extended training in trauma-informed care, as well as understand other resources in the vast resource network, really, that they can get the patient in contact with. We will explore the role of the social worker here in the next couple coming slides, so I'll save that discussion for then. Also, you or the social worker can contact the National Hotline for Human Trafficking, which is, again, presented here. And I just want to note that the National Human Trafficking Hotline is available in 200 plus languages. So you and the patient together can call this hotline and develop the best action plan, or the social worker and the patient can do this, or the patient just by themselves can do this. Because again, this hotline is available in 200 plus languages. So you can give the phone to the patient, have them go in a room, and they can talk in confidentiality with these people and develop the best action plan for them. One last consideration that I'd like to address is the use of ICD-10 codes and documenting findings. Make sure that you use coding and documentation of the medical record in a very cautious and very thoughtful manner, because these findings can be used in a court of law to prosecute traffickers. Let's continue our discussion about the role social workers play in combating human trafficking. And I will make a stance that human trafficking is a social justice issue that calls for social justice doctors, aka the social workers. Let's now discuss the role of social workers in treating human trafficking victims. You, as the future provider, may be wondering, why should I involve a social worker in the care of a human trafficking victim's case? Well, let me read you this quote. One trafficking victim can take the same amount of the provider's time as 20 domestic violence victims. Well, that is certainly a call for a social worker's help. A social worker will be able to explore the various options and various pathways available to these victims to get them the help they deserve. Moreover, they will be able to provide more comprehensive care. As doctors, we are more concerned with the prescription pad and surgery. We need to understand how to get people into the care they need, and the social workers know all the different pathways in terms of economic stability, in terms of legal rights, in terms of getting patients into legal services, I should say, and all sorts of things in which the patient needs that are well beyond the scope of the provider. Now, again, if the social worker isn't available, this should fall on the provider because this is certainly an emergency. And as we saw on a previous slide, the most common location for human trafficking victims to enter is the emergency room. And we know that the emergency room is a place with a lot of turnover. It's moving fast. We got to get patients through. We got to get patients seen. And being able to provide such comprehensive and holistic care to one patient for that long is quite a challenge for an ER physician. And that is why involving a social worker in that type of situation is absolutely critical. Moreover, social workers may have more specific training when it comes to trauma-informed care and dealing with human trafficking victims' cases. This brings me to my next point. Social workers function as social justice doctors and the ways in which they connect patients with the resources to help them overcome the social injustices that made them vulnerable to human trafficking in the first place. Let me explain. Social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. You must understand that human trafficking preys upon social injustices. It preys upon poverty and political ill will and unequal social rights and opportunities that force people into situations that make them vulnerable to be trafficked. We will explore this in greater detail on the next slide. But the key thing is that social workers function as social justice doctors in the ways in which they treat human trafficking victims. They treat them with a prescription pad of resources that promote social justices in terms of economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Let's talk about some of these social justice resources. Social workers, aka social justice doctors, can get patients connected with physical, mental, and dental health services, as well as counseling and rehabilitation services for things such as drug addiction. They can help get them to services for tattoo removal or branding tattoos if they have them. They can also help secure housing, relocation, and witness protection. Social workers can also help get educational and employment opportunities, as well as life and job skills, and help secure a source of income for these victims. Moreover, social workers can help with immigration assistance, such as applying for T visas. T visas are interesting in that they can provide a pathway for citizenship, as well as actually get the victim's family into the United States to receive services as well. Moreover, social workers can help with the coordination with legal services, as well as informing victims of their legal rights. Looking back at our definition of social justice, I think you would agree with me that social workers should be referred to as social justice doctors for the ways in which they write prescriptions for the resources that promote social justice. Let me provide you with an explanation as to why I said on the last slide, human trafficking is a call for social justice that requires the partnership of providers and social workers. To do so, let's take a life course approach. In taking a life course approach, let's analyze the potential timeline of a victim's life course. And sitting here in front of you is the victim herself, a human trafficking victim that is, and this is what you as the provider see in the present. However, what you don't see is the entire life course that happened before this moment in time that led to this person being vulnerable to be a human trafficking victim. Now, let's discuss some structural factors that led to her being vulnerable for human trafficking and ultimately becoming a human trafficking victim. From a young age, she grew up in poverty, in a poor neighborhood with poor living conditions and parents addicted to narcotics. She is removed from her home at the age of 13 due to unstable living conditions and put into foster care. She ran away from foster care due to her foster care family abusing her at the age of 14, and then she met up with a trafficker who promised her a better life. Of course, at that time, she had no idea that he was a trafficker. She thought that he was somebody trying to help her through her hardships and give her economic stability. He had become the biggest abuser in her life to this point in her entire life course, which has been filled with abuse. As a woman, she experiences social discrimination and sex trafficking as she is sold for her reproductive organs, and she doesn't come forward due to fear of legal prosecution. What do all of these things have in common in red? They are all social injustices. And if we revisit the definition of social justice, it is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Reading through these red boxes, it becomes quite apparent that she experienced severe social injustices that made her vulnerable for human trafficking and ultimately led to her being a human trafficking victim. That is why we need social workers to combat this fight, because social workers are social justice doctors. Social workers can intervene at every one of these levels with providing resources and opportunities for economic stability, for political stability, for social rights, and for opportunities. Social workers are truly social justice doctors. So, what do we as providers need to do? We need to be able to recognize the patient in front of us and get them to the real social justice doctors, the social workers. Let me leave you with a quote from John Steinbeck. I wonder how many people I've looked at all my life and never seen. Folks, it's quite possible that you've talked with a human trafficking victim, that you've interviewed a human trafficking victim in the clinical environment, that you walked past a human trafficking victim and never saw them. In all your clinical encounters, try to see beyond what meets the eye. Don't let the next human trafficking victim go unseen. And remember, please use the National Human Trafficking Hotlines for all your questions regarding human trafficking, as well as guidance on how you and your patient can best proceed in reporting human trafficking. And watching a module like this and studying human trafficking and talking about a topic that is so difficult to talk about, you are helping take the next steps to make the world a better place. And if each of us do our parts together, there can be a great big beautiful tomorrow for everyone.